welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy, I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. I have expressed an interest in trying to get more talk about artists and art on this channel, and this conversation that I have for you today is an attempt at doing that. I talk with my friend Nathan, who is a poet and recently released his first audio poetry collection. And I talked with him a little bit about his background and sort of how that helped him in the process of making the poems and creating art. And it was a really beautiful conversation. I really hope you like it because I definitely had a good time. Nathan, thanks so much for coming and talking to me.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
Yes, it's lovely to have you on the channel. Before I start, I usually have people do like a brief introduction to give people an idea of who you are, what's important. But since I don't really, we're friends, but I don't know much about your story. So I'd love to hear a little bit more if you're up for it, to kind of just get a background of who you are and how'd you get to where you are?
Yeah, well, maybe it would be helpful just to say that we first met through Discord, but you were at my wedding not too long ago.
I was at your wedding.
So in Oklahoma, of all places, which is where my wife is from. I'll get to that eventually, but it's a long journey from where I started to there. I grew up in my hometown in central Pennsylvania, which is where I currently live now. It's a rural community, about 10,000 people. I didn't have a religious upbringing. That plays into my story because I fairly recently became Orthodox, an Orthodox Christian, I should say. So I grew up with a pretty secular upbringing. My parents, they took us to Quaker meetings a couple times growing up, but really I had no exposure to organized religion.
Was one of your parents a Quaker, or like they grew up Quaker?
No, my mom grew up Catholic, but left the church soon after she left her parents' home. I think my dad had a little exposure to Quakerism, but was not brought up as a Quaker by any means. So, and the only thing I remember as a kid, I was probably around 10. We did it for about a year off and on. Was a lot of sitting around quietly, which just drove me insane because I was super hyperactive. So and I feel like Quaker meetings, at least the handful that I've attended, they're not exactly what people think of when they think of going to church. At least the ones where I went, where everyone was sitting around quietly in a room for an hour and a half. But anyway, but something I did have at a young age was exposure to a lot of really old books. My dad in particular was a big reader, a voracious reader, and he really encouraged that. So I got my hands on a lot of really good books. And I would say I had a religious experience for the first time when I was about 13 years old, reading the poems of William Blake.
Okay.
And pretty soon after that, I got obsessed with poetry. I started writing poetry, reading poetry. It really fulfilled something that I, looking back, was really lacking, which was a kind of connection to the spiritual world. So to sort of speed things up a little bit, after high school, I really didn't want to go to college, and I sort of just bummed around. I worked a lot of blue collar jobs. I was posing as a poet, just getting into mischief in general, and all the while sort of exploring different spiritual traditions, what I would now consider more esoteric Western traditions, Sufism, the works of Gurdjieff, some people associated with the 60s movement, Robert Anton Wilson, Christopher Hyatt, a few names I don't imagine a lot of people would know, but I eventually went to college as an adult student, and during that time, I sort of had a unofficial independent study in religion. Really just in my spare time, I was looking into specifically Christianity, and I started to think, whoa, it would be cool if this was actually true. And to my surprise, I came to the conclusion that it was. And pretty soon, right before I graduated from my university, I started attending an Orthodox church, to my surprise and the surprise of my family and friends. But
that was not the path I thought you'd go down.
No, I don't think so. I didn't really have any Christian friends growing up. Besides, I had two really good friends, two twins who were Christians. But besides that, my friends knew I was pretty weird. So in a sense, a lot of people weren't surprised. They're like, of course he would become a Christian, because for a lot of people, becoming a Christian, like in your late 20s is strange for some reason.
Odd.
And it was weird for me. It was like I was coming out to my friends and parents as a Christian, which was it's maybe it's strange to say that, but
I think for some people, and like depending on what culture you live in, like that, it does feel sort of like that like hidden self that you have to reveal, that you're not sure how people are going to take. I did not grow up in that culture at all. Like, like culturally, very culturally Christian, and like religion wasn't weird. Just far more conservative. But I know plenty of people who have had that experience where it's like, oh no, I don't know what my mom's going to say. I like Jesus,
Yeah, I mean, it's awful that I had those feelings in a certain way. It's like I should be, I should be happy to share it or something. But yeah, I mean, and for the most part, everyone was very respectful of my decision. But sorry, I got a little jumbled there. I'm not.
No,
where was I
okay.
going? I mean, so a big part, I'll say, leading up to all this, because it sort of ties in with how we originally came into contact. When I was going to college, this was 2015. So, Trump, and then the Jordan Peterson phenomenon kicked off. And I was a fan of Peterson. I really liked him. But I would say it was when I first started listening to Paul Vanderklay and Jonathan Pageau, in particular, those two thinkers, those two Christian thinkers, where there was a real attraction to Peterson, specifically, I think his oratory and rhetorical skills, and how he engaged with the Bible. Because I did have, although I wasn't raised within a Christian community, through William Blake, I should say, for people who aren't familiar with his work, he relies very heavily on scripture. His biggest influences were the Hebrew prophets, and I read all of the books in the Bible that people don't tend to focus on, which is the poetry side of things. I wasn't really that interested in the New Testament. Jesus says some pretty heavy metal things in there, which I enjoyed, but for the most part,
he's mostly quoting the Torah. So
right. I mean, looking back, yeah, I mean, I was really missing out there. But so with Peterson, when his biblical lectures were striking to me, and I wanted it. With Peterson, you reach a certain point And it's like, okay, I need more. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if this is true, I need to go to someone else. And really, Paul Vanderklay and Pageau were that for me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really just a process of, I mean, there was a lot of personal things going on that I don't want to get into, but it was a big it was a big it was an identity crisis. It was like a deconstruction from like my very I don't, I guess, secular, my secular worldview, although I had all these strange esoteric ideas,
Mm.
looking back, they're a little trite. They weren't quite as profound as I thought they were. Just like basically basic nihilism 101 with some some poetic imagery thrown in there, and feelings of self-aggrandizement. But so and the community that Paul Vanderklay, well, he didn't create the community directly, but the Discord community, which I joined, which you're a part of, and which I met my wife on.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Who we've actually
that
had on this podcast. She was
That's right.
my second conversation.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're gonna have to help me out. I'm just
No, you're good.
I'm not sure where I'm going there.
So with the Christianity, was it Peterson that kind of got you interested in delving more deeply in that sort of religious sect, or did it come before and you found Peterson through this sort of digging of trying to understand Christianity?
I'm not sure exactly the order there, but it was Peterson was a big part of that. Like actually taking the claims of Christianity seriously, as far as like, could this be true, basically.
Yeah. And you said earlier you had this like spiritual experience reading these poems by Blake. Describe to me what that means, for everybody. Like, a spiritual experience can mean very different, but like, how did that?
I guess I would say, if I'll tie it into what I understand from Christian worship from like an American context, and from like a more secular context of what I think they would consider worship. So like going to a rock concert, which was something that I would do like in my teenage years and early 20s, that sort of, it's like an ecstatic experience. Those are in a context with other people. So this was like a more private version of that, or maybe like a charismatic worship service where you're sort of like swept away. It's very emotionally charged. You'd have like flashes of insight, basically feeling sort of like an escape from the mundane.
Yeah. And do you think that for yourself, you very often find that within the realm of art, whether it's poetry or music, this ability to escape and like almost have these spiritual experiences through the process of like participating in those?
Oh, absolutely. And we haven't really touched on it yet, but what I found within the Orthodox liturgical setting was something similar to that, in that you were entering a different space, but also profoundly different from the kind of more ecstatic experiences which I first had through poetry, and then I was seeking to replicate and get better and more exotic experiences through these esoteric traditions.
Yeah, well, and we bring up an interesting point about orthodoxy, and I kind of want to pivot here. You recently had a group conversation with Paul Vanderklay about orthodoxy and music and how that sort of links. And I enjoyed what you had to say. It was very interesting, the whole conversation. But I guess I am very interested in understanding what it was about orthodoxy that pulled you, especially since you can look at other traditions, especially sort of the traditions I came out of, these very evangelical non-denominations that do tend to have more of that pattern of playing on those senses and the music and bringing that in and how that plays. I'm just interested in your thoughts and sort of the way you saw orthodoxy and shifting that and changing that.
So my initial attraction to orthodoxy probably was twofold. One, the aesthetics, which we're talking about now. The other was, and I want to be sensitive here because I don't have knowledge of Western traditions from a experiential point of view, besides a handful of services. But I saw a lot of churches and Christians growing up sort of as, nice people who were maybe just a little deluded, sort of effeminate. And now looking back, I can see how that's a gross mischaracterization. But and what I saw within Orthodoxy was a more robust, disciplined, demanding way of approaching spirituality. So the Orthodox services, so the first service I went to was a week before Holy Week. And then I sort of had this conversion, come to Jesus moment, and I was starting to look for a church. And part of me really didn't want to become Orthodox because of, I knew enough about it. There was I'd have to do all this discipline. I have to go to confession. People would be on me more, at least in my mind. So, but when I first went to the Orthodox service, I would say I was most impressed. And then going through Holy Week, I was most impressed with the, it was directed, it wasn't about me. It was, the worship was directed towards God. And I saw an attitude of reverence that I had just sort of caught glimpses of from my my lived experience. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it definitely at least touches the top of the iceberg. Because I mean, it's just very interesting. I think your assessment of it not being about you is so true from my experience in the Orthodox tradition, where, we submit to this liturgy that's older than us. It's not really about whether I like it or not. And there's something about the way that the Orthodox, walk through their liturgy, where it's we don't, we do this because this is what has been passed down. We don't really care about, it didn't seem as much like caring about how people would perceive the things that they were doing. Whereas I grew up sort of in this non-denominational world, and there was a lot of times where you definitely felt this temptation to fall into this consumerism habit, where it's we have to design church the way that people want so we can grow our churches and be bigger and be sustainable, which in some senses is not, I don't want to say it's a bad way to think, yet it seems to open the door to a lot of corruption and manipulation of church and people for an end that
and to be totally honest, I mean, I very much was something of a spiritual consumer. I think part of that's just historical. I was exploring all these different Christian traditions through the internet. And, I was just most attracted. I mean, there was very much a trying to figure out what was true and looking at, from a propositional point of view, what seemed most coherent. But I just found Orthodoxy the most attractive, and I went to a service and I had a good experience, and now I'm Orthodox.
Yeah.
I don't want to downplay that, but yeah.
Well, it's not to say that Orthodoxy doesn't have that pitfall too. The aesthetics, the beauty of the churches, the way that things are there is in some ways a novelty to it. And when I hear that criticism, it's like this double-edged sword where I'm like, yes, but that, I don't know, I think it misses the point of like what's happening with all these people who are finding Orthodoxy and finding life in it. But it's not to say there isn't that sort of draw to it because of what the feel and what it gives. But to me, it doesn't seem as catering to the modern whim as Protestantism did, where the last few churches I went to, they very much wanted to create a space where a modern person could feel comfortable.
Sure.
And it created certain patterns with the way the buildings were designed, how the services were run, but particularly how the worship was adapted. And I battled a long time with it, because for me, I didn't think there was anything inherently wrong with it. Yet I always worried me of like, what are we doing? And is this in the right frame, or are we losing sight of the thing that is at the core of what we're teaching? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I'm following you there.
I mean, were you ever, you looked at all of these different sort of religious tradition. Was there ever a part of you that was drawn to some of these more modern churches?
I would say I was most attracted. I sort of looked at Quakerism again. The Quaker, the modern Quaker church, from what I can tell, it's sort of split into there's the more traditional biblical minded Quakers, and then there's Quakers who are like, well, Christ is part of God, but like he's not really, not really God. It's more of a fuzzy God. And I really liked that. So, I mean, I was either going to go, I think, non-denominational, sort of like do my own thing, or like Quaker. That was sort of my leaning. It was either, which, I mean, this is not fair, but I was going to sort of continue basically my spirituality before I became a Christian through one of these Protestant traditions, or become Orthodox. Those were sort of the two things that I was most drawn to.
Interesting. So what ended up being that thing that pushed you over the edge towards Orthodoxy? Because obviously there was something in you that didn't want to be.
I don't know. I think as a lot of things. I really, I've always had a sort of anti-authoritarian bent to me, but at the same time, I was in martial arts. I played soccer in college. I really like discipline. And when I first became a Christian, it was really a traumatic experience. My life had sort of fallen apart. I hurt some people, I betrayed some people, and it was sort of out of necessity that I went to the Orthodox Church, because I felt like that was the only place where I would be able to be healed. So it was much more existential. I mean, I love this corner of the internet and all the dialogues and trying to parse out these different factors, but when I think back on that period of my life and why I became a Christian and then joined the Orthodox Church, I really I have no idea
Yeah.
how, why, how, any of that. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Well, life experiences and the way we choose life, they're so embodied. It's not just this happened and then
Yeah.
there's emotional reasons, there's life reasons, there's evidential reasons. All these things come together in this sort of mash. But I tend to live my life to all the different denominations that I've chosen to, participate in and be a part of. I couldn't tell you why. It was mostly instinctual, whereas I just think I have to learn this. And I obviously have reasons for why I became Orthodox outside of just it felt true. But that's true. The reason I kept going is it felt truer than anything else that I'd been. But I had no way to tell you why, except that it was this experience of liturgy. So I totally get that.
Yeah. And I have a good friend who's charismatic Christian, and I really love that approach. And there's something about the human experience that I think lends itself to those. It's like were the early Christian, the people the Gentiles who converted, were they, like having these kind of debates before they converted? I'm not debates, but conversations that we're having now. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows?
I don't know.
Who knows?
They're definitely having certain conversations.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if they're as casual as what we end up having. I don't know. Maybe not. You just read some of the old philosophers, and it just they just feel like, or even like, I don't know. I don't know. I just feel like you watch old period pieces, and they feel very, very much more formal in the past than we are now. But there probably is just a variety of all of those things. Well, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. So kind of rolling into that, you consider yourself an artist, you're a poet.
Sure. No, yeah? I do. I mean, or I guess poets are a subcategory of artists. It depends on how you want to roll that out. But yeah.
There's probably a lot of linguistic caveats for all of these things.
Sure.
But how do you see this background of where you came from to where you are, and this continued conversations that you have about these big questions? Do you see that affect the way you shape your art and what you do?
Yeah. So as far as how I got from where I started, reading poetry and having these experiences to where I'm at, it was really through beauty that I would say it was through poetry that God really ministered to me in the end, because part of what led me to having these questions about, is Christianity true? Is there truth with a capital T? Was I took poetry fairly seriously as a young person, and I had multiple points in my life where my life had basically fallen apart because I was focusing on poetry was my religion, and poetry is a horrible god. Like, it's going to destroy you every time, especially when you mix in, very childish ideas of romance and et cetera, et cetera. So I would come to this point where I was like, why am I doing this? Like, this is ruining my life. Like, you have these experiences, especially if you're an artist, you know what I'm talking about, where you're sort of in this flow state where you're creating something, and it's just like, yeah, this is why this is why I'm alive. Like, this is what I should be doing. But my life just wasn't working. And I'm like, is poetry and making poems, is this something that is it connected to something that's real? Like, am I like tapping into like beauty with a capital B, or is this something that I'm just creating through my own will and projecting and sending out into the cosmos to like affect things and impress people and get what I want. And then trying to figure out whether my vocation as a poet was something connected to the real really was what brought me into Christianity. So and what I found in the Orthodox Church was it's like an embodied experience. I mean, if you've ever been to a Orthodox church, you know that it's just embodied poetry. I mean, the hymns, the choreography of the liturgy, it's a kind of poetry in itself.
Well, and it's the whole liturgy itself, it plays on all of the senses. You have the visuals with the icons, and then you have the poetry, but then you also have the melodies and the chanting and the way they sing it and the incense. And there's this whole embodied experience that I do think elevates it into something.
And it's with other people.
Yes.
That's the big thing.
Yeah.
You know, just doing spirituality on your own, it's dangerous because we're all pretty stupid. And not just that, even our insights, we twist them, and we go off on these wild adventures with them that are often destructive to ourselves and others. So
yeah, it's easy to deceive ourselves or get caught up in that rush of that feeling of this spiritual connection and lose sight of the way that it fully embodies and lines up with something. So to have something to hold on to hold up to these things that you're experiencing and the way that you're understanding the world, there's something so like important about that. I think there's all of these different churches trying to do that in different ways. Yeah, and it's interesting to see how those projects work and how effective they will be long term.
Yeah, we'll see, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm very grateful for Protestantism, even though I'm not a Protestant anymore. And I try to be very careful when I talk about it because I see my issues with it, but I wouldn't dare discourage someone with a conviction of Protestantism to abandon it, because that's their conviction. And if you don't live true, at least to yourself and what you believe, you're doing a disservice to the journey of what it is to find spirituality in an earnest way. But the thing that I did, one of the reasons I did end up ultimately making the switch, there was obviously certain things about it that I couldn't believe anymore. Just some of the Protestant dogmas like sola scriptura and faith and faith alone, these things that I started seeing the cracks in. Wait, hold on, that's I don't know if I believe those things, but I started losing a confidence in the sustainability of creating like healthy spirituality. Especially with some of these more modern Western traditions, because for me, it was like the minute you try to make something modern, hip, cool, it's the minute you've already lost the game, because modernity changes so quickly. What's new, what's relevant today is gone tomorrow. And so you're constantly going to have to change and shift and adjust. And there's only so much pivoting a person can do to have like a steadiness in a participation in something bigger than yourself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't a Protestant, although I will say my my priest, when I first started attending the parish that I'm at, he gave me a book which was addressed to Protestants, and it sort of put the two traditions side by side and was like, here's the difference. And what he said to me, he was like, I know you didn't grow up a Christian, but you grew up in America, so you're a Protestant. and I can see some truth in that. I mean, I didn't have I didn't have a lot of the benefits that you would get from a Protestant upbringing, but there is a certain spirit of actually, I'm going to stop talking because I don't know. It's not appropriate for me to just make pronouncements like that. But I will say that to echo what you said, my experience with spirituality before I became a Christian, it was very I used to think of myself sort of as a chameleon. Like one of the values that I did get from some of my practices was, and I became very adaptable. And that's something that I think, we can all take things from our past, regardless of our current positions, and find the value in that. But I became very adaptable, but it was very ungrounding. I mean, I'm comfortable in the chaos and I'm sort of wired that way, but there's something about these traditional Christian communities and practices that is very grounding for me.
Yeah, I know it was very bittersweet for me, I think, leaving, because it's like I spent so much of my time engaged in these type of communities and building relationships and building ministries within these type of communities. And I see all of the beautiful things that it still gives. I think there's so much beauty that comes from the Protestant tradition. And I mean, all the traditions have their certain type of beauty for sure. But that was that hard thing where it was like, as much as I have a love and appreciation, I'm only going to corrupt it if I continue walking down a path pretending I believe it or I'm okay with this when I'm not. Because that was one of the things that originally got me looking for a new church. I had this experience in this little church in Portland that basically got me to a place where it was like, oh, where I'm at is bothering me a lot more than I thought. And it's more detrimental to me than I thought, where it was like the first time in maybe years I had been in a church and not continually bothered by everything around me and questioning it in my head. And like, it felt like
that's not a good place to be.
No, I always say it felt like I had been treading water. And then all of a sudden I realized I was in the shallow end and I could stand up and breathe. It's like that moment where it's like, oh, I don't think I can keep doing this. So it's like, I'll be open to something else. And that's when I joined very quickly after I joined the Discord and started meeting all these Orthodox people. And it was like, wait, I don't know anything about Orthodoxy. And it very quickly shifted from there. But there was something, I think I needed to go through all of that and get to that place where I was at the end of myself with the tradition that I was in, because it made it easier not to go back.
Okay.
And it's not that I have anything against it, but for me, just I'm very much a committer. So if I commit to something and I'm like I'm going to do it, I don't like to break or fall through. And so it would be easy to like, even the day I left, there was still mind. I'm like, am I doing the right thing to leave?
Sure. I think that's healthy.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's constantly this like wrestling with God, right? Israel is to wrestle. And so there was this beauty in the wrestling, but there was definitely certain things that kind of shifted in me. And I think you're mentioning of the capital B beauty, that's really where I think a lot of things switched for me, because Shelley's priest gave me that book and Ethics of Beauty. Changed the game for me, where it's like, wow, okay, switching from this idea of a truth first ethic of always trying to get the propositional and the idea of what is true in my head and then acting out, whereas you're shifting to this idea of approaching things that are beautiful and living a beautiful life and letting that teach you what's true and what's good. That it doesn't exist as clearly in Protestantism as it does in Orthodoxy for me. And that for me, it's definitely shifted the way I approach life and make choices, but also the way I approach ideas. And I think as an artist, it's helped me embody the way that I naturally am more into this sort of search for capital T truth.
Yeah. And Ethics of Beauty, I'll just say, because Father George gave us that book as our wedding present. And I'm always hawking it on people. I'm like, you got to read this book. And I think it's just so much more human. Like there's a place for debates. There's a place for having these in-depth conversations, but there's the more human way, I think, of engaging with these things is through acting them out. It could be having dinner with someone, or helping someone move, or it's those patterns of living that really is how we can participate with God.
Yeah, and I think the way that most people act out in the world too, whether they recognize it or not, where I think in the West it's very much rationality is king. We're evidence-based. We want to, I believe this because I'm a rational person. Yet we look at children grow up and what do they move towards? The things that bring joy, that are beautiful. And, you learn from those things. And even as adults, I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, we have these intellectual reasons of why we believe what we believe, especially for the big questions.
Yeah.
But most of the time, what really resonates with us is the story it tells, the beautiful world we see through it. And I know it's really made me shift and change my thought about the power of storytelling and art, and the way that it shapes our minds to prime us to believe different things, and the way that we consume rewires us, but then the way that we create and what we put out, it then has this ability to put out these ideas and sometimes viruses into the world. And
and that's I mean, that's something I would like to ask you, because since I became Orthodox, so I'm a Western person,
as am I.
right? And I have this repository, this like treasury of English poetic tradition that I was raised on, that I'm still a part of. But now I'm, the most important thing in my life is my faith, and I'm sort of struggling with how to reconcile those two things. I just wonder if you've had that experience since coming into Orthodoxy, of trying to figure out how the faith can inform / be the foundation for art, for creating. And then the anxiety is like, I'm like, oh, my is this heretical? Like, should I is this verse appropriate? Like, should I go back and revise these old poems?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely made me think more deeply about the things that I create. And I think it has created it's almost deeper foundation, where I think I've gotten to the place where I recognize I'm a modern person. I can't deny that. And there's always going to be something in me that's wired to be Western, and something that's wired to be Protestant, because that is what I was given. Yet I've sort of just let my participation in Orthodoxy slowly rewire me in a way where it shapes me to think more Eastern, but still express in a Western way, where I can find a way to marry them both. And I'm not by no means imperfect at it, but I found that when I really dive in and understand this this different type of thought, I can take that and like insert it into this Western world, and it creates even a deeper sense of what I can create, or even what I can consume. Like I watch TV shows now with the idea of patterns and symbolism and beauty and the ethics, and even when they're not pointed towards things that I think are morally true, or even, evidentially true or whatever, to me, I can still see it and see how what its story it's telling, and where it's pulling from places of truth, and how it can almost show me the way people think and what they're believing, and get a better understanding of why, even if I don't believe it myself. So it's like, for me, it's been exciting because I feel like it finally opens up the door to like create in a way that has far more freedoms than I felt sort of in my Western box. But maybe I'll feel more reined in the more I get into Orthodoxy, but I don't know. That's how I felt.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think that's sane. I mean, I have a tendency to overthink things. I think
Me too.
part of that's just temperament, but yeah, I mean, the embodiment is key. I think, like, just engaging with whatever your spiritual practice is in the most embodied way possible, and sort of seeing the fruits of it and adjusting accordingly. And the nice thing about the Orthodox Church is that, like, if I do something really stupid, I'm gonna eventually have to tell my priest about it, and I'll be corrected. But yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think there's so much of the Western world that's built on Eastern philosophies, like America. Like you said, if you're in America, you're Protestant, because what happened? The Protestants left England to have religious freedom, and obviously there was a lot of different people who, settled in Americas. You had the French in Canada, who were trying to do trade, and then you had the Spanish coming from Mexico up California, and so that's more Catholic, and they also had a mission, but was to convert everybody.
Right.
So and then eventually the Protestants won out for the full settlement, and then Andrew Jackson came in and like expanded it, Manifest Destiny, a lot of moral gray areas and all of that. But there's just this sense of this Western world that's built on Christianity, whether you believe it or not. And we see it in this Western frame. But underneath all of that, it's like, but this is a very ancient Eastern tradition. Sure. So we're looking at it through the lens of modernity and rationality, but that was not the lens that the ancients were looking at it through. And so it has a bit of a distortion to it. Not that you can't get certain good out of it, but it has a distortion because we're not looking at it through the frame that was meant to. And honestly, because I think most people think ancient people were stupid. Which I'm sure there was stupid ancient people, but there were also very smart ancient people. I think that for me has been a big thing too, of having more respect for what the ancients gave to us and how it still affects us today, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yeah, I mean, I was somewhat inoculated against. I part of what I liked about Orthodoxy was that it is that pre-modern mindset. My dad was always very much of the mind that you should never read anyone that's alive. That was something that he sort of like. He's like, if they're dead and they've been dead for 500 years, and people like, Shakespeare, like if people are still reading someone after 500 years, they're probably worth looking into. So,
well, something resonated with it, right? It lasted the test of times for generations to generations. So there must be something true, like capital T true and capital B beautiful about the thing if it lasted. So I can understand that.
Yeah.
It leads the question though, what about all of these things that may last 500 years that were written yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, but it's interesting though, because we kind of are at a disservice to how technologically savvy or developed our societies are, because now anybody can put words to a page and
start a YouTube channel.
Yeah. But I think sometimes it leaves the sense of intentionality that I think the ancient people had, where it's like, if you're going to write something down, it better be important, because it's not as disposable it is now, where I can write something on a napkin and throw it out tomorrow and it's stuck in a landfill and never to be seen again.
I was recently been reading The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis, and it's just a little throwaway line where he talks about how in medieval era, a philosopher would take, if it was written down, it was important. So like a poet might have theories on, like, I don't know, the stars or grass, and he would take that as seriously as the philosophers or the natural philosophers. And we don't, we have our critical thinking, right? Which is, it's hard to think critically, and but
yeah, we definitely live in a weird world where we're privileged to have these things, yet it's also to our detriment and our disservice. And finding ways to balance those things, because it's so all consuming. Like the technology just, it opens the door to so many things, yet it sucks us into believing certain things are more important than they are, or that we have the answers to things that ancients didn't. And it's like, I think maybe we're just misunderstanding. I'm sure we have some probably answers that the ancients didn't, but nothing's new under the sun.
Yeah. I wouldn't have become Orthodox without the internet. I highly doubt it. But
well,
yeah, there's that danger of there's a danger of being disembodied. Like, look at us, we're two heads on, it's, like, you can't see our legs, like it's, but at the same time, it's a return to an oral culture, especially with YouTube.
Right.
There's the return of the oral.
It all comes back.
No, it's fascinating to think about.
Well, that's another thing that I've been wrestling with too, and maybe we'll have to have another conversation, because it could go on forever. But like this idea of the limitations of the internet and online communities, but also like there's an infinity with it too, or at least an extended reach. Like you and I both met our partners on the Discord through the internet.
Yeah, and I like to I'm not a Luddite, but I'll make comments about how horrible technology is, and Shelley's like, well, remember how we got married? And I was like, yeah, and how I became a Christian, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
but like it's there's this thing where it's like I've made the deepest connections I ever had between friends and relationships through this online platform and the internet.
Yeah.
Yet I've also seen the extreme detriment and limitations of not being grounded and embodied in a place. And for me, it's sort of this balance of how do you use the tools that technology gives us to move back to a more participatory, embodied, present world. That's, it almost seems backwards and wrong or paradoxical. But
I think actually Orthodoxy has some answers here. And I think a lot of it is, I've only heard a couple of Orthodox people advocate this, but I'm sure more are. There's a lot of fasting in the church, and the idea of a digital fast, like I tried and failed horribly this past nativity fast to put this into practice. Like getting off social media during Lent or every Wednesday and Friday. It's not, that's not going to be like a silver bullet by any means, but I think as modern people, we need to really think carefully about what our relationships are to this new technology.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to incorporate the sort of fasting idea, because it's not opting out and
Right.
pretending it doesn't exist or it doesn't have value yet. It's reining in and restricting and creating this exercise so that it doesn't rule you.
Yeah.
And it's probably a tricky balance, especially when you go these very I read this book on willpower a while back, and it was talking about dieting and how these very restrictive diets aren't actually healthy, but also they're not very helpful in actually maintaining a good lifestyle, because what you do is you restrict for so long, and then all of a sudden you eat one M&M, and then it's sort of the what the hell effect, where it's like, well, I might as well binge out. And so finding these ways to have it so it's not this very restrictive extreme and swinging from extremes to extremes, but finding a way to make it a cycle and more
that's built into the liturgical calendar. I mean, there's fasting, but the fasts lead up to feasts, and that's humans are built for feasting as much as fasting. So.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too. When I told my parents I was becoming Orthodox, they were a little skeptical of it.
Sure.
Especially because they just grew up in traditions that were sort of skeptical of Catholicism or high church in general. But they thought that I was entering into something that was going to be super legalistic. And what I found in Orthodoxy, it's far less legalistic in practice than some of the Protestant traditions that I've been a part of, where it's, there's these structures and these strict things, but their fasts are, removing rich foods because we believe that the body and the spirit are very intertwined. That's not the word, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're connected. And so to rid yourself of rich foods can get your physical body ready for the time of these spiritual celebrations. And so but you still got to eat. Whereas before it's like, well, we fast because, we take on suffering so that we remember God. And like fasting, that I guess there's a piece of that, but it never felt full. Whereas Orthodoxy, it seemed fuller, and it seemed a lot less strict, where it's like, oh, all we're going to eat is like juices and water and, broth. Whereas like, well, I at least get to eat, some veggies and some rice. And, so it's interesting, the perception that it gets, where it's very strict and stringent, yet it is and it isn't. It's I don't know. It's
the idea of fasting, I always thought of it as just refraining totally from whatever that would be, but that's not. I mean, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, fasting is just setting aside certain things.
Well, it's so helpful when you have a community of people to do those things with, and in a way that's balanced, because I'm very naturally disciplined person. I like structure. I like order. But I'm weird. I'm this contradiction, because I like that, but I also like chaos and flow. But for me, I can find ways. I do tend to be that person that goes from extremes, where it's like a very restricted, very structured to nothing. And with Orthodoxy, it's definitely created more balance in my life, where it's like more consistency and less demand. And that's been something so interesting. And just the way that these things and these practices just naturally have changed me and softened me and slowed me in ways that were a net positive, versus being sort of that question of like, is this good? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
it was a huge relief for me when I started going to Orthodox services and committing to that, to attempting that lifestyle. It's just, it's not a matter of figuring, like there's no there, you're still figuring things out, but the big questions are laid out, the protocols are laid out. It's a matter of navigating
Mm.
like how to utilize the tools that are already there and have been there for for millennia. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a huge relief for me. It was a huge relief. Just not being your own spiritual director is exhausting, not
Hmm.
aside from being dangerous.
Hmm. Well, and then there's definitely churches that try to kind of do this discipleship model where it's like, well,
Mm,
this person will disciple these people, and like having some of this order, they're trying to create it. Yet, um, I think there's so much disconnection to the root of what Christianity was that it's hard to find a balance of what is healthy
mm,
in challenging, and what kind of suffering are we called to, and how do we bear that cross and take on those burdens. And I mean, there's obviously been that in the Orthodox Church as well, and
yeah.
this balancing act of trying to figure out what that means and what's a healthy participation in spirituality. But it is there is something relieving about having a system that has worked for thousands of years,
Yeah.
and there seems more of a methodology behind it that feels a little more solid, and that I feel easier to trust.
Yeah. Yeah. And to go back to that, the Ethics of Beauty book, uh, what I found really fascinating about that, among other things, was the emphasis on the East of tackling your physical passions. So,
Mm,
gluttony, um, lust, like uh, in the West, Dr. Petitsis sort of points out that there's often a much larger emphasis on pride and sort of the more heady passions.
mm,
But the Orthodox approach was always to deal with the day-to-day bodily side of things first,
mm,
which intuitively, we've touched on this a little bit, just makes more sense to me.
mm. Yeah. No, I think you're right, because it's that those sort of more tangible needs that can go off the rails.
Mm,
I think the way you participate in those have such a bigger impact on the more intellectual side of um, what could be considered sin.
mm.
That, yeah, it does make sense, but somehow we've lost that sense of the connection between the two.
I have one of my bedside books is the homilies of Saint Isaac the Syrian, and I love eating. I struggle with overeating, and he has just a little line in there that says that you'll never understand the mysteries of God on a full stomach.
Mm,
And yeah, I think there's some truth to that.
yeah, probably is. So I know that you recently released a little audiobook of poems. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure, yeah, I can plug that real quick. I'll say this project has been in the making for about 3 years now. I had a good friend. I have a good friend. His name's Lance. He's sort of been on this journey with me. We met online as well. We were part of this group of people doing these weird spiritual practices. I won't go into that, but we both were starting to look into. We were like, oh man, like Jesus is so cool. Like, what a badass. Like, wouldn't it be cool if he was like actually God? But anyway, um, he plays. He's a classically trained guitarist, and I've done some work with him before with his band, writing some songs, and we collaborated. And part of this was realize, well, first of all, people today rightfully aren't interested in poetry because uh, poetry today basically just, it sucks. I mean, when you think about poetry today, it's usually like, you know, either like Instagram poet or professor or homeless person. It's just not very appealing. Popular popular songs, singer-songwriters are rightfully the ascendant form, the closest thing to poetry we have today. But anyway, I'm rambling. So I made this audiobook, in part because I feel like people just aren't interested in poetry as a written form as a whole. I mean, rap is probably actually the closest thing that we have to poetry today that is popular. So the audiobook is called Approaching the Cup. There's 18 poems. One of the poems I wrote as a teenager, but I really felt that that with the return of the oral through YouTube, I mean, YouTube it is probably the Gutenberg press of our era, and I think that if we're going to have any kind of even minor resurgence within poetry for the culture, it's going to be through the spoken word. So I collaborated with my friend. He put guitar to some poems, and
are there any kind of specific themes or
so it's sort of a spiritual autobiography of sorts. There's only one poem. It's the final track on the poem, which I wrote after becoming a Christian. All the rest of them most of them were primarily written in the last 5 or 6 years, but they span close to 15 years of work. But it's not a narrative by any means, but there's a loose thread.
Well, it's interesting you took all of these poems from your past, and I think we write from what we know and where we are, and so you can naturally see this evolution in this story, even if you're not trying to. By the different versions that you are. That's very cool.
I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I mean, I know I'm super sensitive to how lame it can sound. One, just like I was not one of these people that I was like, I'm a poet. Like, it's just as the kids say today, it's cringe. But yeah, I'm trying to step out of that mindset a little bit and try to be an advocate for poetry today, because there are some great poets, and I think as modernity recedes, as Paul Vanderklay likes to point out, and Jonathan Pageau and the soul corner of the internet, I think we're gonna have an opportunity, especially as artists, to revivify a lot of these old forms, to re-enchant the world, because I mean, the world's being re-enchanted whether we like it or not. So especially as Christian artists, I think we have an obligation and an opportunity to reclaim some of the territory for Christ. So
no, I like that. I like that phrasing of re-enchanting, because I think that is what artists are doing, whether for Christianity or not. There's a magic, there's an enchantment that's happening within that. And so that's very interesting. And as much as it can be uncomfortable to call yourself a thing, the best way to own it and to revive it is to
you really do have to
call it like we are. So you're a poet.
No, I am, and I thank God, because I probably wouldn't be where I'm at without poetry. So
well, great. Well, I'll put that link in below so people can check it out. And
great, thank you.
Yeah, no, I've had fun. Any last words before we close?
I don't think so. No.
All right.
Yeah.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me on.
Well, thank you, Nathan.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching. If you want to check out Nathan's poetry, I have a link down below. Otherwise, that's all I have for you. So like always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.